Have you ever had a night so scary that it felt like a real nightmare? Imagine being trapped in an old house during a storm, while unexplained sounds echo through the walls and a stranger carries macabre secrets. In this story, you will discover what happens when fear goes beyond the limits of the imaginable and how a young woman had to face the impossible to survive. Get ready, because this rainy night will make you question what is real and what is pure terror. Oh, before we continue with the video, just check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because here we will bring you a series of videos like this with incredible, terrifying stories for you. We continue. It was a seemingly ordinary night in the small town of Dark Stone. Louisa, a 28-year-old woman, was in her old house, a place that looked like it had come out of a storybook. The walls were covered in dark wood, creaking slightly with each gust of wind. The clock on the wall read 9 p.m., but the sky was already completely black. The rain started slowly, a drop here, another there, until, suddenly, it seemed like the sky had collapsed. The storm was fierce, accompanied by thunder so loud that it made the ground shake. Lightning illuminated the interior of the house for seconds, revealing grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. Louisa, sitting on the couch with a cup of hot tea, looked out the window. She couldn't help but feel uneasy. Something about the rain seemed wrong. She tried to distract herself. She turned on the radio, but the static was deafening. She tried to access her cell phone, but of course the signal had disappeared. This was normal on stormy nights in the city, especially in this rural area. But there was something else, an eerie silence between the thunder, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a flash of lightning lit up the entire yard, and Louisa thought she saw something move near the old oak tree in the garden. She couldn't be sure. It was too quick, like a shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that the mind plays tricks on us when we're alone. The rain intensified. The windows began to vibrate, as if someone was trying to force them open. A metallic sound echoed from the kitchen, something like a pan falling, although Louisa was sure that everything was safe. With her heart beating faster, she grabbed a flashlight and went to check, each step feeling heavier than the last. Nothing in the kitchen seemed out of place. I must be imagining things, she whispered to herself, but when she turned to go back to the living room, she heard something that chilled her spine. A soft tapping on the window, a sound impossible to ignore, considering that the window was on the second floor. And then, at the height of the storm, Louisa realized that this would not be an ordinary night. The rain seemed to hide more than just water. It carried secrets that were about to be revealed. The knocking continued, rhythmic and insistent, as if something or someone was waiting for her to respond. Louisa froze in the middle of the hallway, the sound of the rain filling every corner of the house. She tried to rationalize. Maybe it's just a branch hitting the window, she thought, but something inside her told her that it wasn't that simple. She gathered her courage and walked slowly towards the living room, where the window where she had heard the sound was. The flashlight trembled slightly in her hand, reflecting her insecurity. When she reached the living room, she stood still for a moment, staring at the window. The weak light of the lightning illuminated the glass, and there was nothing there. No branches, no leaves, just the rain running in rivers across the surface. I must be getting paranoid, she whispered to herself, trying to shake off the growing tension. But when she turned to leave the room, she heard it again. Knocking. Only now, it was coming from another direction, from upstairs. Her heart raced. There's no one here. I locked all the doors. I checked myself, she thought, but logic seemed powerless in the face of that sound that now seemed closer. The knocking was followed by something else, a light scratching, like nails scraping against wood. Louisa slowly climbed the stairs. each step creaking under her feet. The flashlight illuminated the narrow hallway on the second floor, with the bedroom doors closed as always. But the sound was there, coming from the last door, the attic. She hesitated for a moment. The attic was a place she rarely visited. It was full of old boxes and things that belonged to her grandparents, many of them forgotten over time. But now, it seemed that something or someone wanted to get her attention up there. Deciding she needed to face this once and for all, Louisa walked over to the attic door and reached for the handle. The sound suddenly stopped, plunging the house into an unsettling silence. For a second, she thought about giving up, about going back to the comfort of the couch and ignoring whatever it was. But something inside her insisted on continuing. With a turn of the handle, the door creaked open, revealing the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The air there was colder, almost freezing, as if the storm had found a way to get in. Climbing. Carefully, the flashlight illuminated the piles of boxes and furniture covered by dusty sheets. It was then that she saw it. In the center of the attic, a circle of water accumulated on the floor, as if the rain had broken through the ceiling. But there was no sign of a drip, and in the middle of that water, a small object was shining. Louisa approached slowly, but before she could see what it was, the knocking started again. This time, right behind her. She turned quickly, but there was nothing. Nothing but darkness and the echo of the drops falling outside. The feeling of being watched grew, squeezing her chest like an invisible weight. Something was wrong. Something was there with her, but it was hiding in the shadows, waiting, and Louisa, without realizing it, was already right in the middle of something she couldn't understand. Louisa came down from the attic with her heart racing, trying to ignore the feeling that something was following her. Reaching the hallway, she almost tripped when she heard a new sound, different from the knocking or scratching from before. It was deeper, more human. 3 loud knocks on the front door. She froze halfway up the stairs. Who would knock on the door in the middle of a storm, so late at night? The lights were flickering due to the electrical instability, and the rain, as heavy as it was, made it seem impossible for anyone to be outside. Even so, the sound repeated itself, insistent, reluctantly. Louisa went to the door. Before opening it, she peered through the peephole, but her vision was blurred by the raindrops running down the glass. She could only make out the silhouette of a person, apparently soaked. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice sounding firmer. Then she felt inside. "Please help me," answered a male voice, hoarse, almost pleading. "I'm lost. My motorcycle broke down on the road, and this was the only house I saw with lights on." Louisa hesitated. It was a plausible excuse, but something in the man's voice bothered her. However, her conscience accused her. Who would leave someone out in the rain on such a violent night? She took a deep breath and opened the door, just enough to get a better look at him. The man was really soaked. His black hair stuck to his forehead, and his clothes stuck to his body. He looked exhausted, but there was something about his face that made her uncomfortable. Maybe it was his gaze, too fixed, as if he were studying every detail of her. "I just need a place to shelter until the rain stops," he said, taking a step forward. Against her instinct, Louisa opened the door. "Come in, but only until the storm passes," she said, trying to sound confident. The man entered without saying anything else, and the first thing she noticed was a leather bag he was carrying. It was worn and had dark stains, which could just be dirt from the road, or something else. He placed it on the floor next to the door with excessive care, as if its contents were more important than his own safety. "You can dry yourself with this," Louisa said, handing her a towel. He accepted, but his eyes lingered on her for too long, as if he wanted to say something but decided not to. As the man dried himself off, Louisa asked, "Where are you from?" The nearest road is miles. Away! I'm traveling for work, he answered vaguely, looking away. Something felt wrong, but Louisa couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe it was the way he was looking at the house, as if he were more interested in the surroundings than in sheltering from the rain. Or maybe it was the uncomfortable silence that had settled between them, broken only by the sound of the storm outside. And then, without warning, the man broke the silence. This house, have you lived here long? Yes, Louisa replied, surprised by the question. Why? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the bag on the floor and murmured, "It's a special house." Louisa felt a shiver run down her spine. Something in his tone made it seem like special wasn't a compliment but a warning. The man's presence was strange enough to make Louisa uncomfortable, but the bag he was carrying seemed to draw more attention than he did. It was a small, dark leather object, so worn that it seemed to have survived decades of use. He placed it next to the armchair where he sat, but he never took his eyes off it, as if he were afraid that someone might touch it or open it. The storm continued to rage outside, thunder lighting up the room for fractions of a second. Louisa tried to hide her uneasiness, but it was difficult to ignore the tense atmosphere that seemed to envelop the room. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked, trying to ease the silence. He took a while to answer. "Yes, sometimes being alone is necessary." The answer was vague, but the way he said it made Louisa feel as if there was an invisible weight to the words. Before she could ask more, her eyes involuntarily returned to the bag, and that was when she saw it. The dark stains were not just dirt. Something dry red was stuck to the leather. "Blood! Are you hurt?" she asked, trying to hide the tension in her voice. The man stared at her, his eyes fixed on hers in an almost disturbing way. "No, I'm fine." He then pulled the bag closer, placing it between his feet as if he were protecting a treasure. Louise tried to ignore it, but her curiosity was starting to overpower her fear. Something about that bag seemed wrong. It seemed important. "If you need help, I can," she began, pointing to the bag. "No!" His shout was so sudden that it made her take a step back. He quickly seemed to realize that he had overreacted and tried to compose himself. "Sorry. It's not something you need to. See, it's okay." His attitude only increased the tension in the room. Why would someone carry something like that on a trip? And why so much secrecy about it? In an attempt to distract herself, Louise went to the kitchen to prepare something for him to drink. While filling a mug with coffee, she listened attentively to the movements in the room. The sound of his wet boots on the wooden floor seemed to echo more than it should. Each step measured, almost as if he was surveying the place. When she returned with the coffee, she noticed something that chilled her blood. The bag had been moved. It was now lying open next to the fireplace. She could see a small glimpse of something inside, an old notebook with yellowed pages and drawings that looked like strange symbols. "Did you go through my bag?" He was standing, looking at her as if he could read her mind. "No, I just went to get the coffee," she replied, trying to sound calm. The man approached slowly, picked up the bag, and closed it again with a quick gesture. "It's just something personal, you don't need to worry." But now, Louisa couldn't stop worrying. What was he hiding? And more importantly, why did he seem so obsessed with protecting it? As he sat back down, Louisa noticed something frightening. The room seemed colder than before, and the sound of the storm seemed distant, as if the house itself were closing itself off from the outside world. And the bag seemed to emit a presence of its own, as if it were alive, waiting to be discovered. The silence in the room was almost unbearable, as if the storm itself had decided to stop to listen to what was about to happen. Louisa was restless, her eyes constantly returning to the mysterious bag, even when she tried to feign disinterest. The man, on the other hand, seemed increasingly tense, as if he were carrying an invisible weight that made him restless. It was then that he broke the silence. Do you believe in things that cannot be explained? The question seemed to come out of nowhere, but the serious tone in his voice made Louisa feel that the answer was more important than it seemed. Unexplainable things, she repeated, trying to buy time. You mean like ghosts? He shook his head, staring at the floor. Ghosts are just the beginning. There are things much older, much more dangerous. Louisa felt a chill. Like what? He looked up at her, and there was something in them that made her flinch a little. Like what's inside this bag? She tried to laugh, but the tightness in her throat made it impossible. Are you serious? More serious than you can imagine. He paused, as if deciding how much to reveal. I shouldn't be here, not in this house, but the storm. It brought me to you, to this place. Why this house? What's so special about it? The man sighed, running a hand through his soaked hair. Did you know that the house where you live has a history? An ancient history, one that you may never have heard of. Louisa was silent, waiting for him to continue. A long time ago, a ritual was performed here, something that should never have happened. And whatever was summoned that night never really went away. He looked at the bag with a grave expression. What's inside is part of that. It's what's left. Louisa felt panic rising inside her. Are you saying that my house is haunted? He shook his head again, this time more intensely. Haunted is not the right word. This house, it is a door, and something is trying to break through it. Before she could react, the man stood up, clutching the bag tightly. I carry this to stop it from happening, but the storm weakens the barriers, and I need you to help me. Help me? How? Louisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, as if he knew the truth might be too much for her. You need to let me open this bag. Here, now, or something much worse will happen. Louisa recoiled, shaking her head in denial. This sounds crazy. I don't even know who you are, and you want me to trust you to open something that clearly shouldn't be opened. But before she could say anything else, a terrible sound echoed through the house, a deep rumble, as if something was scratching the foundations of the house. The ground shook slightly, and the lights flickered violently. The man looked at Louisa with an expression that was part despair, part determination. We don't have much time. If we don't act now, it will be too late. And Louisa, despite every instinct inside her screaming to run, realized there was no way out. Something had been awakened, something that had been waiting for this rainy night for a long time. The man's words echoed in Louisa's mind as the house seemed to take on a life of its own. The walls creaked as if protesting the storm outside, but the deep sound coming from the floor was worse, something primal, something that seemed more alive than a simple vibration. You have to trust me, the man insisted, his voice raised, to be heard above the growing chaos. He was clutching his bag so tightly that his knuckles were white. Trust you? I don't even know your name. Louisa replied, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. My name doesn't matter now. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on hers. What matters is that this house was the scene of something terrible many years ago, and what was done here is trying to come back. Louisa hesitated, looking around. The lights flickered incessantly. The sound of the rain seemed distant, muffled, as if the storm were being sucked out of reality. The room was growing darker, even with the lightning outside. Something was definitely wrong. What do you want to do? She asked, finally giving in to her growing panic. The man slowly opened the bag, and Louisa held her breath. Inside was an old notebook, its leather cover even more worn than the bag. He removed it carefully as if it were made of glass and placed it on the coffee table. This notebook contains the ritual that was performed in this house. It was written by those responsible for it as a kind of record or warning. I found it years ago, and ever since, I've been trying to keep what they summoned locked away. Louisa felt a shiver as she looked at the notebook. The pages were covered in symbols and drawings, none of which she recognized. There was something deeply disturbing about them, as if the very features carried a negative energy. "And now you want to repeat the ritual?" she asked, her voice a thread of disbelief. "Not repeat, reverse." The man quickly flipped through the notebook, stopping at a specific page. The ancients partially sealed the entity, but they made mistakes. The seal was never strong enough. It's weakening over time, and the storm, it feeds what's trapped. Louisa looked at him as if he were crazy. "And how do you know all this?" He hesitated before answering. "Because I was sent to protect it. It's my job, and now I need you. I need the energy of this place, your presence, to finish what they started." Louisa felt the ground shake again, louder this time. A low sound, like a growl, seemed to come from deep within the house. Something was there, something was trying to escape. "If we don't do this now," the man continued, "this thing won't be trapped anymore. And believe me, if it gets out, no one in this city will be safe." With trembling hands, Louisa took a step forward. "What do I need to do?" He pointed to the notebook, to a page with a strange circle drawn on it. "We're going to recreate the seal. All you have to do is repeat the words after me. But be careful. If we get it wrong, we could make things worse." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation. The house was growing darker and darker, the air heavy, almost suffocating. She knew she had no choice. Whatever was down there waiting could not be freed. "Let's do this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. The man opened the notebook completely and began to draw the circle on the floor with chalk he took from his bag. Each stroke seemed to pulse with energy, and Louisa knew she was about to face something far beyond her comprehension. With precise movements, the man drew the circle on the ground, his hands quick and steady despite the evident tension in the air. The drawing was detailed, composed of symbols that seemed to vibrate with their own energy. Louisa watched in silence, feeling the air around her grow heavier and heavier, almost impossible to breathe. "Stay inside the circle, no matter what happens," he said, his voice firm. Louisa stepped into the circle, her heart racing. She tried to control her breathing as he continued to work, adding candles to specific spots and lighting them with matches that seemed to break the silence with each crack. The sound coming from beneath the house was growing louder. It was now a deep hum, mixed with something that sounded like slow, heavy footsteps. "Repeat exactly what I tell you," he ordered, holding the notebook open in one hand while pointing to the symbols with the other. He began to recite words in a language Louisa had never heard before. His voice was steady, almost mesmerizing, and the sound seemed to resonate throughout the room. When it was her turn to repeat, she struggled not to make a mistake, even though the words came out hesitantly. As the two of them recited together, the lights flickered frantically, and a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing all the candles except the ones inside the circle. Louisa felt the floor vibrate beneath her feet, as if something were rising, closer by the second. "Don't stop!" the man shouted. "It's working!" She kept going, even as a deafening noise echoed through the house, as if something was trying to break down the barriers between them and whatever was below. The circle seemed to glow faintly, offering a last refuge from the chaos around them. Louisa knew they were approaching the crucial moment, and that they could not make any mistakes. As the last word of the ritual was recited, the entire house seemed to shake. A deep sound, almost like a muffled scream, echoed from deep within. The circle on the floor glowed brightly for a brief moment before casting a dim light toward the ceiling. Louisa looked around, her eyes wide. Was that enough? The man didn't answer. Instead, he fixed his gaze on a spot on the floor, right in the center of the circle. The wood there began to slowly crack, and a dark, almost liquid glow appeared through the cracks, forming a spot that seemed to pulse, alive. "This isn't the end," he said finally. "It's the beginning." Louisa felt her stomach churn. "What does that mean? You said the ritual would stop that." To stop her from leaving completely. Yes, but opening the portal, it was inevitable. Now we need to seal it for good, and that takes more than words. "And now you want to repeat the ritual?" she asked, her voice a thread of disbelief. "Not repeat, reverse." The man quickly flipped through the notebook, stopping at a specific page. The ancients partially sealed the entity, but they made mistakes. The seal was never strong enough. It's weakening over time, and the storm, it feeds what's trapped. Louisa looked at him as if he were crazy. "And how do you know all this?" He hesitated before answering. "Because I was sent to protect. It's my job, and now I need you. I need the energy of this place, your presence, to finish what they started." Louisa felt the ground shake again, louder this time. A low sound like a growl seemed to come from deep within the house. Something was there, something was trying to escape. "If we don't do this now," the man continued, "this thing won't be trapped anymore. And believe me, if it gets out, no one in this city will be safe." With trembling hands, Louisa took a step forward. "What do I need to do?" He pointed to the notebook, to a page with a strange circle drawn on it. "We're going to recreate the seal. All you have to do is repeat the words after me. But be careful. If we get it wrong, we could make things worse." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation. The house was growing darker and darker, the air heavy, almost suffocating. She knew she had no choice. Whatever was, down there waiting could not be freed. "Let's do this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. The man opened the notebook completely and began to draw the circle on the floor with chalk he took from his bag. Each stroke seemed to pulse with energy, and Louisa knew she was about to face something far beyond her comprehension. With precise movements, the man drew the circle on the ground, his hands quick and steady despite the evident tension in the air. The drawing was detailed, composed of symbols that seemed to vibrate with their own energy. Louisa watched in silence, feeling the air around her grow heavier and heavier, almost impossible to breathe. "Stay inside the circle, no matter what happens," he said, his voice firm. Louisa stepped into the circle, her heart racing. She tried to control her breathing as he continued to work, adding candles to specific spots and lighting them with matches that seemed to break the silence with each crack. The sound coming from beneath the house was growing louder. It was now a deep hum, mixed with something that sounded like slow, heavy footsteps. "Repeat exactly what I tell you," he ordered, holding the notebook open in one hand while pointing to the symbols with the other. He began to recite words in a language Louisa had never heard before. His voice was steady, almost mesmerizing, and the sound seemed to resonate throughout the room. When it was her turn to repeat, she struggled not to make a mistake, even though the words came out hesitantly. As the two of them recited together, the lights flickered frantically, and a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing all the candles except the ones inside the circle. Louisa felt the floor vibrate beneath her feet, as if something were rising, closer by the second. "Don't stop!" the man shouted. "It's working!" She kept going, even as a deafening noise echoed through the house, as if something was trying to break down the barriers between them and whatever was below. The circle seemed to glow faintly, offering a last refuge from the chaos around them. Louisa knew they were approaching the crucial moment, and that they could not make any mistakes. As the last word of the ritual was recited, The entire house seemed to shake. A deep sound, almost like a muffled scream, echoed from deep within. The circle on the floor glowed brightly for a brief moment before casting a dim light toward the ceiling. Louisa looked around, her eyes wide. Was that enough? The man didn't answer. Instead, he fixed his gaze on a spot on the floor, right in the center of the circle. The wood there began to slowly crack, and a dark, almost liquid glow appeared through the cracks, forming a spot that seemed to pulse, alive. "This isn't the end," he said finally. "It's the beginning." Louisa felt her stomach churn. "What does that mean? You said the ritual would stop that." To stop her from leaving completely. Yes, but opening the portal, it was inevitable. Now we need to seal it for good, and that takes more than words. Before she could question it, something began to emerge from the black glow. First, a hazy shape, twisting and shifting like living smoke. Then eyes, several of them glowing red, were fixed directly on Louisa. She instinctively backed away, but the man grabbed her arm. "Don't leave the circle, it still protects us." The creature let out a horrible sound, a mix between a scream and a roar that made Louisa's ears throb. The air around it seemed to vibrate, and everything inside, the house, furniture, paintings, even the windows, began to crack and shatter. "We need to act quickly," the man said, pulling a strange dagger from his bag. The object was small, but it looked ancient, with inscriptions that glowed faintly on the blade. "What are you going to do?" Louisa asked, panic evident in her voice. "Seal the passage from within." He looked at her with a serious expression. "But I can only do that if you keep the creature distracted. It can't reach me while I complete the seal." "Distract it? How?" "Talk to it, scream. It doesn't matter how, just don't let her notice me." Louisa swallowed hard but nodded. She knew she had no choice. With the creature approaching, its breathing heavy and its piercing gaze fixed on her, Louisa opened her mouth to scream, "Hey, whatever you are, look at me!" The creature hesitated, its form contorting, as if deciding whether to advance or retreat. But its eyes were all on Louisa now. Meanwhile, the man knelt in the center of the circle, holding the dagger over the pulsing spot. "Keep distracting it!" he shouted, his voice drowned out by the growing roar of the storm. And the creature, Louisa, felt her courage waver as the being began to slowly advance toward her. But she knew she had to hold on. The fate of all of them, and perhaps something even greater, depended on it. The creature advanced, slow and menacing, its glowing eyes fixed on Louisa. Each step seemed to suck the heat from the room, leaving the air freezing and heavy. Despite the fear that dominated her, Louisa screamed again with all the strength she had. "It's me you want, isn't it? Then come, I'm here." The creature seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if trying to understand the challenge. Its nebulous form rose, growing even taller, and it let out a deep, guttural sound that made Louisa's ears ring. Behind her, the man was kneeling, his hands steady, holding the dagger over the pulsing spot in the center of the circle. He murmured, words in an unknown language, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The blade began to glow, emitting a warm light that seemed to fight against the growing darkness. "You're doing well! Keep going!" he shouted, without taking his eyes off the notebook open in front of him. Louisa took a deep breath and tried to stay focused. "What do you want? Why are you here? Talk to me!" She knew it was unlikely she would get an answer, but she needed to keep distracting her. Suddenly, the creature stopped, its eyes fixed directly on hers, and Louisa felt as if her mind was being invaded by something cold and ancient. A voice, hoarse and low, echoed in her head. "Why fight the inevitable? Open the portal. Let me through. Everything will be rewarded." Louisa shook her head, trying to shake off the suffocating feeling. "You will not pass. You should never have been here." Her scream seemed to have had an effect, for the creature writhed, letting out another deafening roar. But at that moment, Luisa realized that the man behind her had stopped muttering. He was still, his dagger still raised, but something was wrong. "Why did you stop?" she screamed, not daring to turn completely to face him. "I need more strength," he replied, panting. "The portal will not be sealed without a sacrifice." The words chilled Luisa's blood. "Sacrifice? Of what? What are you talking about?" He looked up at her, his expression heavy with regret. "That's why the storm brought me here. I need you. Your energy, your soul. It's the only way." Louise recoiled, her eyes wide. "Did you know that from the beginning?" "I wasn't sure," he admitted. "But now, it's clear. Without you, this will never be stopped." The creature seemed to sense their hesitation. It took another step forward, and the circle began to tremble, its edges glowing unsteadily. Louisa looked at the man, then back at the creature. She knew there was no easy way out. If they didn't act quickly, whatever was trying to break through the portal would be released, and the world would never be the same. "If it's going to stop this," she said, her voice shaking but determined, "I'll do whatever it takes." The man looked at her with sadness and respect. "I promise your courage will not be in vain." He reached out to her, and Luisa, her heart pounding, took it. She closed her eyes as he began to murmur again, feeling the warmth of the circle grow around her. The creature let out a final roar, almost in protest, as the light from the dagger filled the entire room, consuming everything around it in a blinding flash. And then, silence. When the light disappeared, the house was eerily silent. The storm had ceased as if it had never been, and the only sound left was Luisa's heavy breathing. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking to adjust to the darkness that now seemed ordinary, almost welcoming. The circle on the floor was dim, its edges blurred, as if it had never glowed with energy. The dagger lay in the center, embedded in the wood, still emanating a gentle heat. Luisa was alive, exhausted but alive. She looked around, searching for the man. "Did you get it?" she asked, her voice weak. There was no answer. He wasn't there. Only the notebook remained on the table, open to a blank page. All the writing that had once filled its pages had disappeared, as if its function had been fulfilled. Luisa felt a lump in her throat. He had sacrificed himself, she thought. Maybe that had been the plan all along. He knew someone would have to pay the ultimate price. She slowly approached the dagger and hesitated before touching it. When she finally pulled it out of the ground, she felt a wave of warmth run through her body, along with a strange sense of relief. The portal was closed. She knew that. The threat had been contained. But there was something different about the house. The previously heavy atmosphere seemed light, as if the building itself had let out a sigh of relief. The cracks in the walls and floor had disappeared, and even the furniture was in place, as if the chaos of the previous night had never happened. Louise staggered out of the house, the dagger still in her hand. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly, and the street seemed incredibly quiet. She turned to look at the house one last time. Now it looked ordinary, almost inviting. But Louise knew the truth. She knew what was buried beneath those boards, what had been contained there. She gripped the dagger tightly and promised herself that she would never let anyone open that portal again. In the distance, a thunderclap sounded, soft, almost inaudible. Louisa took a deep breath and began walking, knowing that her life would never be the same again. So, have you ever heard about the scary story of terror on rainy nights? Leave a comment with what you know about it, and if you believe in these stories. Continuing, Louisa walked through the deserted streets, a feeling of relief mixed with an overwhelming tiredness. Each step seemed heavier than the last, but she didn't dare stop. The dagger in her hand seemed to pulse slightly, as if it still held a remnant of the power that sealed the portal. The city was strangely silent, as if the world around her was. In mourning for the sacrifice made that night, the streetlights dimly illuminated her path, while shadows danced on the corners, creating shapes that made her heart race. When she finally got home, she felt a mix of security and vulnerability. The door seemed heavier than ever when she pushed it, and the sound of her keys falling on the table echoed through the small, empty apartment. She left the dagger on the kitchen counter and sank onto the couch. Every muscle in her body ached, and her mind was overwhelmed with everything that had happened. The face of the man who had helped her, and who had disappeared in the process, kept appearing in her mind. Who was he really? She muttered to herself. There were no answers, only doubts that seemed to gather like a fog around her. The notebook. Louisa stood up with difficulty, remembering the book he had left behind. She had brought it with her, an impulse she could not even explain. The object was now in her bag, untouched. She placed it on the table and opened it again, but as before, the pages were completely blank. "Why are you empty now?" she asked, as if the notebook could answer her. Before she could investigate further, a low, strange sound cut through the silence of the apartment. It was a whisper, faint, coming from the direction of the dagger. Louisa froze. The object glowed, faintly, and the air around it seemed to move, dense, as if charged with electricity. What does this mean? She approached slowly, trying to understand. When she reached out to touch the dagger again, a familiar feeling took over her. That same energy she had felt in the house during the ritual, but this time it felt softer, almost protective. Louisa realized that even far from the house, the connection with what had happened that night still existed. The dagger and the notebook were not just objects, they were a legacy, a responsibility that now seemed to weigh on her shoulders. Sitting down again, she sighed deeply. She knew that her life would never be the same, but she still didn't fully understand what that meant. All she knew was that somehow there was something bigger lurking, something she would have to face again, and this time she would be alone. Well, we are already unraveling this story more and more. But before I continue, I realize that you still haven't liked this video, which is very important for YouTube to help promote our content. So leave your like on this video, which is free, okay? Let's move on. Louisa sat on the couch, staring at the dagger and the notebook, now inert but full of meaning. The storm had passed, but inside her, a new uneasiness was beginning to grow. That night had changed her forever. She was no longer the same woman who had entered that house. As her eyes scanned the blank pages of the notebook, something revealed itself for a brief moment, a bright, almost imperceptible symbol that disappeared as soon as she blinked. Her heart raced. There was no doubt, it wasn't over. She knew the portal had been closed, but something deep down told her that greater forces were still at work. The feeling of being watched would accompany her ever since, like a shadow that never completely disappeared. She looked out the window and noticed something curious. On the horizon, dark clouds were beginning to form again, and the distant sound of thunder echoed, faint but present. Louisa knew she couldn't run away. She had been chosen by chance or fate to face what no one else would dare. And now it was just the beginning. If you thought this story was intense, wait until you hear the next ones. Curious to know more about the secrets that Louisa discovered, or what else might be hidden in the world around us? Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. Now it's your turn. Would you have the courage to enter that house during the storm? What would you do in Louisa's place? Leave your comment and share your ideas. Your participation is the fuel that makes us create increasingly exciting stories. Are you ready for the next rainy night?